So my name is Andrea Bernasconi. I'm a medical doctor and I work at the Montreal Neurological Institute since '95. So it's been a while. My passion has always been imaging and specifically imaging of epilepsy. I couldn't think of a better place to do that. And that was the idea to come here. I'm actually from Switzerland and came over as I said, in '95, and found at the MNI the ideal environment really to develop something relatively new. So the application of imaging, specifically MRI and image analysis, not only looking at the MRI, but analyze its content. I find that a wonderful place here to develop a career in that domain. And because the MNI is not only a hospital and a research institute, but it's also harboring a very renowned imaging center. And so you put these things together and the magic happens. So that's why I sticked around. The epilepsy research per se was, it's more a passion with imaging and images that I had throughout my life. Before coming here, I was doing stroke neurology. And there it was quite obvious that imaging is a very important tool. It's a little bit less obvious in epileptology because the real classical tools are EEG and electrophysiological tools. So imaging was a little bit different. In a sense, it kind of attracted me, maybe just because of that. And so here I found the perfect environment to do that. And so the idea was, and inspired by the place, because people before me, like Dr. Anderman, and even going back to the tradition of the place, Penfield, they really put an emphasis on lesion detection, imaging, obviously adapted to the times, but that's the motivation and the driving force to do what I do. Yes, I did, actually. I was supposed to stay here 2 years. And then because the environment was so conducive to my visions, and when I say actually it's not only mine, it's my wife and me. We kind of developed the lab, the ideas we had together. So when I talk about me, I basically talk about us. So it's a joint venture that we have done, and so yeah, that's the story. Maybe I should start from the beginning. It's more about the problematics of drug-resistant epilepsy, which is a very prevalent condition. It affects 100,000, maybe 120,000 people in Canada. So it's a relatively small fraction of the whole group of epilepsy patients, but it's a very serious condition with psychosocial consequences. It can lead to brain damage. Ultimately, you have comorbidities developing, and actually, unfortunately, the mortality increase. So it's a very serious condition. And the way we establish this up to date is essentially by trying several medication, and more medication we have, more trials we do. And this, unfortunately, spans over many years, at times over 20 years before saying, oh, well, this patient is intractable. It should be referred for a pre-surgical evaluation, and finally maybe a surgery, which is very successful in many cases. The causes of this are essentially two main causes: hippocampal sclerosis related to temporal lobe epilepsy, and malformations of cortical development related to other extratemporal epilepsies. So this is the bulk of the story. So the thing is that we cannot predict at the disease onset, very early in the phase of the condition. We cannot predict patients when they come to our attention. As soon as they develop epilepsy, really we cannot predict who is going to become pharmacoresistant, and even who is going to respond to surgery. So we want to really try to catch this information very early in the disease, and so that is basically the motivation of the project. And it's very difficult to do this simply by looking at the semiology or at the EEG, for example. You cannot predict if somebody is going to be drug resistant just with these two elements. But luckily we have MRI. And MRI is, to me, at times I compare this to a genome. It's a very wide array of information, and we basically don't exploit to the point we should, because we basically just look at it instead of taking the MRI as the center of a more personalized, patient-centered treatment, and use the wealth of information in an MRI in the way that we should to predict drug resistance. Well, the EEG essentially is like an electrocardiogram of the brain. It's essentially you put wires on the head and you collect, or you measure, you detect the electrical activity of neurons. Neurons, they talk through electricity, so you can listen to that, you can see it, you can measure it. The MRI is about imaging, it's about images, it's about seeing. But it's not only that, it's about quantitation. We want to quantify number, metrics of volume, shape, function. We can even measure networks. We can measure velocities of information through the MRI. The more you go, the more complex it gets and the more information you can obtain. So it's not simply looking at the images. It's really going beyond that and taking advantage of the information that is there, but is not necessarily harnessed in a proper way. We are not alone in epileptology, luckily. I think the MRI is a center modality, a core modality of whole neuroscience. So we kind of surf on a wave of progress that is really driven by progress in neuroscience, and image analysis. And by this, specifically, I mean lately artificial intelligence. We didn't call that way artificial intelligence many years ago, and I'm not necessarily an expert. I consult with people in the field here at the MNI. As I said, there is a whole community of scientists here that can help us in developing this tool. And basically, we have questions, and the beauty of working here is that you have questions and you just try to answer them in a very specific and personalized way. It's not simply taking a tool and applying, it's developing things according to our needs. So that's the very fascinating part of, obviously, every research, but particularly in MRI. It's very flexible, it's a very flexible tool, and we develop essentially biomarkers, things that can give us information about biology simply by extraction from a digital entity, which is an MRI. So the one real challenge overall in MRI is almost the acceptance from the community that MRI can go way beyond simply looking at images. I'm not talking about radiology per se, or radiological inspection, saying, well, there is a lesion, maybe there isn't, so people can argue endlessly. So I like to have metrics, measurements, and in our most recent research, we append also degrees of confidence of such metrics. So we ask computers using deep learning, other techniques that are used, for example, in text mining, analyzing books and texts. We transform these technologies to detect lesions or to detect heterogeneity, variation along the disease spectrum in our patients, and try to really harness this power for personalized treatment. So one of the challenges is to convince the community that these are useful tools, and to me it's just a matter of time. The other challenge specifically for this project was to collect patients, naive patients that had just started the epilepsy, maybe even not the anti-epileptic medication, and scan them, acquire an MRI, and so get this set of images very early in the stage of the disease and follow them over time, because this institution is primarily focused on epilepsy surgery. So we get patients with established chronic drug-resistant epilepsy. So the way we proceeded for that is to set up a multicentric international collaboration. We get data from abroad, and so we can expand our pool of patients. But that was one of the challenges. And for the rest, as I mentioned, I'm very privileged to work here in an environment that, you know, the sky is the limit in a sense. So for that, I'm really privileged. Yeah. Specifically, one institution that is very renowned for dedicating their research is in Italy, in south of Italy, and they collect specifically, for many years, they have collected data of these patients, so we can analyze such data, and that's a specific institution. Well, we have done another collaborative study in detection of focal cortical dysplasia using deep learning, as I mentioned before, with metrics of confidence. And that was, I think there were 9 centers across the world, including China, where you have a lot of cases, China, France, Germany, Italy. So it's a tendency. I think people have realized over the years that that's a good, it's a good avenue. I think the hope is really to get, in a nutshell, it's translation. I think that's a core problematic and a wish that I really have. I myself, I don't use artificial intelligence. I've never used ChatGPT. I don't want to do that. I am fascinated by the power of these technologies for the medical purposes. I think that's where the future lies, nevertheless. Obviously, we have to have an eye on it, and not really about the power that is unleashed, but rather the ethics related to the use of these technologies, specifically when applied to patients. So it's obvious we have to have I'm pretty convinced that it's just going, and there is no way is not going to permeate the treatment, the translation, and making healthcare more affordable to everyone, because everyone can have an MRI, and so developing predictors very early can really democratize, if you want, access to care. You know, it's almost very difficult to keep up with the pace. I'm mostly interested in imaging, so I don't look much into basic science stuff, so it's not really my domain, although I'm aware of what's going on there. And I'm particularly interested in genetics, and we have done studies correlating MRI and genetics and try to, for example, in cortical dysplasia, to map on the MRI the genes that co-localize with the focal cortical dysplasias, and found, in fact, as predicted, that the mTOR pathways or the genes that regulate the mTOR pathway co-locate with lesions specifically in the frontal lobe. So these kind of things we can combine, but I'm not doing directly genetic studies. Again, the future to me lies in the way we analyze images, and we dig deeper and deeper into an information that, you know, we have studied latent factors. We study, you look here, but there is something here going on that you not necessarily look at. So, but if you collect this information, you maybe enhance your power in detecting anomalies and significant changes that otherwise overlooked if you use a one-fits-all approach rather than a personalized image analysis. So that is what fascinates me, and I think that's where the future lies, in quantitation more and more. I think the very fundamental primary thing is that it's a treatable disease. Obviously, we have talked about drug-resistant epilepsy, but I think the majority of patients can be treated very well with medication, and even those that develop drug-resistant epilepsy can be treated with surgery with fairly high success, provided we find the lesions to operate. And that's where one of the other axes of our research has been very proactive in trying to find or to deconstruct the notion that there are MRI negative patients where the MRI doesn't show anything. In fact, you can easily overlook very subtle lesion of cortical dysplasia, but if you use quantitation, as we discussed before, you enhance your power, so you reduce the number of so-called MRI negative cases. And we have done a meta-analysis that just published now in Epilepsy, And we have demonstrated that about 40% of patients that are initially declared as MRI negative, they become MRI positive if you do processing, and thus they may benefit from successful surgery. So I think that's one thing that we should translate to the public and say there is hope even if there is drug-resistant epilepsy, and the MRI is a center component or a pivotal component of the whole investigation. That's one thing that I want to convey, yeah. Well, one thing is photography. I like photography from, I like minimalistic photography and landscape photography because I like to bike, to hike. We go off with I say I, but people that know ourselves, we always do things together with my wife. So we go bike, we go hike, and I like music a lot. I play piano, so that's my other passion. So I guess that's it.